Hi there, my name is Matti Sulanto. I'm a photographer based in Helsinki, Finland. In this video, I'm gonna take a closer look at the Panasonic Lumix S1R full-frame mirrorless camera. If you like my content, please consider subscribing to my channel and click the bell also so you won't miss any of my future videos. I will publish a new video every Tuesday and every Friday. And just to make this clear, this camera is on loan from Panasonic and I'm not getting paid for doing this video. I'm just doing this because I want to share this with you guys. I have here the S1R and the 24-105mm f4 kit lens. The camera body is running a firmware version 0.7, so it's not the final production version. Everything seems to be working fine, but there can be some minor improvements or bug fixes for the final production version. This review is based on my shooting with this combo for about a week now. I did some street photography and I did a small portrait session with some friends for their social media. I've also gone through the menus so many times that I can pretty much find what I want blindfolded by now. In this video, I'm going to mention some things that came up when I was using the camera. I'm not going to go through and review each and every feature. But let's start and see how good this is, or if this is any good. You all probably know the main specifications already, and you can check them on Panasonic's website, so I'm not going to read them. But here's a short recap. This is the 47-megapixel S1R, which is more photocentric of the two S models. The S1 is the 24-megapixel version and that has more comprehensive video features. However, this S1R is pretty good video camera too, and I'll get back to that in some later video. And I plan to shoot my next YouTube video also on this S1R, and that's gonna be out next Friday, so make sure to check that one out. This is not a small camera by any standards. And it can even be a bit too large for small hands. My hands are probably about average size, and I never felt that this camera is too big or too much to carry around. I was walking around Helsinki for several hours on my street photo walk that I arranged for myself. I was using this wrist strap and holding the camera like this, and it never felt too much or too heavy. And also during the portrait session, the camera was comfortable to hold. And need I say that of course, when I was working outside, I was wearing gloves. And this camera was really comfortable also to handle with gloves. All the controls, all the main controls are large and clear, and there's ample space. So I could easily work with gloves too, and that's important in cold climate in winter time. The only thing I would probably change is the power switch position, which I would like to have around the shutter button like it is, for example, on the Lumix G9 and also many other cameras. So far I've photographed mostly still subjects. And the autofocus has been working really well. And the autofocus speed, at least with the kit lens, feels really fast. It feels as fast as Micro Four Thirds Lumix, and that means fast. There is no back and forth movement typical for some early contrast detect autofocus systems. The focus just moves from A to B really quickly. The face and eye recognition is reliable, but sometimes the camera chooses the wrong eye, the one that is further away from the camera. But if this happens, you can easily select the other eye just by pressing the joystick. If there are multiple faces in the frame, pressing the joystick will switch between the faces. The autofocus has quite a few options, and I think it's gonna take some time to figure out the optimal settings for each scenario and each photographer. But so far, based on my experience, the autofocus works really well for what I do. The S1 and S1R could be the most customizable cameras there are. First of all, you can separate the video and still settings 100%. And that makes it really quick to move from video to stills and back if you need to do that. But you can also leave some of the settings the same for both stills and video if you think that's a good idea. Needless to say that all the dials and buttons can be customized almost every way you can imagine. But of course there are some limits. I found a perfect manual mode setup by selecting the aperture to the front dial, shutter speed to the rear dial, and the ISO to the back dial. On the aperture priority and shutter priority, the front dial selects the corresponding aperture value, and the rear dial selects the exposure compensation, and the back dial the ISO. On the P mode, the front dial takes care of the program shift, the back dial the rear dial takes care of the exposure compensation, and the rear dial selects the ISO. It's pretty neat. I have a separate dial for each of the exposure values. If I'm using auto ISO on manual mode and I need to use the exposure compensation, then I have to press the button and use the rear dial to set my desired exposure compensation. The battery life seems pretty decent despite the modest SIPA numbers. I can't say exactly how many shots I get on a charge because so far I've never run out of power, and I have charged the battery every day for the next day, so I won't run out of power. However, the 380 shot SIPA number seems fairly conservative, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. And on top of that, I was using the 120 frames per second Viewfinder refresh rate, which is more power hungry than the optional 60 frames per second. But the Viewfinder is just so gorgeous that you want to take all out of it. You can charge the battery either in the camera or in the charger. And the charger can be powered from any USB-C power outlet. And then there's the dual image stabilizer, which is awesome. I managed pretty easily to get sharp results at around 1 second exposures. But longer than that required quite a bit of concentrating, and my results were not constant at all. But like I've said before, the effectiveness of any image stabilizer depends highly on the photographer and how steady his or her hands are. And if you can lean on something for support, you can get probably a lot longer exposures handheld. And that combined to 47 megapixels is pretty awesome, and it gives the photographer quite a bit of creative flexibility. And it can also save the shot in a tricky situation. Maybe a tripod is not allowed, maybe it draws too much attention, maybe you forgot to bring your tripod. There are so many situations where the image stabilizer really saves the day. There is something called image stabilizer status scope in this camera, and it's pretty entertaining. It shows you how steady your camera is during a long exposure. Or rather, it actually shows how unsteady your hands are. It may sound like a gimmick, but because the viewfinder and the screen are black during a long exposure, the scope actually gives some useful information of the camera shake during the exposure. I'm not going to comment the image quality because the raw files don't open in Lightroom. I have a SilkyPix beta that opens the raw files, but to be honest, I don't really know how to use it and how to get the best out of it. For pixel peeping, I really want to see the image files in Lightroom because I'm familiar with that. However, I tested the high-res mode that creates a whopping 187 megapixel image file. But there are some limitations. You're going to need a tripod. And after the camera has exposed all the 8 exposure it needs to make the high-res file, it takes about 13 seconds for the camera to process the files into one single file. And during that time, you can't do anything but wait. Also, the highest ISO is limited to 3200 and the longest exposure time is 1 second. But the good news is that the high-res mode suppresses noise really effectively. The high-res file is very detailed. It's hard to say though if it would match real pixels. Probably quite not, based on my experience on other cameras with similar sensor shift high-res mode. But nevertheless, there is still a lot more details in the high-res 187 megapixel file than the low-res 47 megapixel normal file. And the high-res file comes out also in RAW, which is of course almost mandatory if in any serious use. There is also a high-res mode for minimizing motion blur. The camera uses any one of the 8 exposures and tries to correct the motion blur in that particular area in the image. The result will be a bit smaller image file depending on the subject, how much movement there is. I didn't really get enough results on that, so I can't really say how effectively it works. I hope I can get back to that in some later video. Even though the high-res mode sounds really impressive, and it is impressive, it's still for special occasions where you really need that extra detail or all those extra pixels. After all, there is quite a bit of details also in that low resolution 47 megapixel file. But the high-res mode is still a nice option to have. The Panasonic Lumix S1R is not a sports or action camera by nature, but sometimes it's necessary to shoot a sequence. The S1R can shoot 36 RAW files until the buffer is full. And while the buffer is full, you can browse the images, but you can't zoom in for details. I'm using a Panasonic branded fast SD card, and that cleared the buffer in about 20 seconds. I have no idea what would happen with an XQD card because I don't have one. When the buffer is full, you can still continue shooting at the pace of about 1 frame per second. I find this lock lever really practical in a studio or in any situation where I need my settings to stay the same throughout the whole shoot. You can select which controls are locked when this lock lever is in use. I prefer to lock everything except the shutter button, of course. The controls on this camera are good, but it's still easy to accidentally bump, for example, the aperture or the shutter speed in the middle of the action. But when you lock everything, you can be sure that nothing gets changed by accident. The menus can be pretty exhausting because there are so many options. But the new menu system is good, and if you have used a Lumix camera before, it's pretty easy to navigate through the menus after some practice. Also, the new Q menu on the rear screen is much better than the old one, and you can also have a different Q menu for stills and video. That's also very nice. I like this Lumix S1R a lot. And I also hope that some of the features from this camera will end up to the next pro-level Micro Four Thirds Lumix camera. That's it this time, but there's gonna be more about the S1R in the future. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.